My name is Audrey, and until about a year ago, I thought my life was, if not perfect, then at least stable. I was married to Scott. On the surface, Scott was the perfect husband. He was handsome, charismatic, successful in his field of financial consulting. He had a smile that could charm a snake and a way of speaking that made everything sound like the most reasonable proposition in the world. Our friends saw us as the ideal couple. We had a beautiful home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. He had 2 nice cars in the driveway, and what everyone assumed was a shared, beloved dog. A goofy, golden-hearted retriever named Buster. But a beautiful frame can't hide a cracked painting forever. The life I was living was a carefully curated illusion, and the curator, Scott, was a master of the art. The cracks started to show slowly. Then all at once, as they so often do, my biggest flaw, in Scott's eyes, was my volunteer work. 3 days a week, and often on weekends, I spent my time at the local veterans hospital. It wasn't glamorous. I wasn't chairing galas or rubbing elbows with wealthy donors. I was in the trenches, working with a program that socialized and trained therapy animals, primarily dogs, for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. It was the most meaningful work of my life. I would help with the training, the feeding, the cleaning of kennels, and my favorite part was the weekend foster program. To get the dogs used to a home environment, volunteers could take them home from Friday evening to Sunday night. That's how Buster came into my life. He wasn't ours. He was never ours. He belonged to the program, a registered, documented therapy animal in training, on loan to me as part of his development. Scott hated it. He never said it directly, of course. Scott was too clever for that. Instead, he'd use that charming smile and a tone of gentle concern. He'd say things like, "Audrey, honey, I love that you have a hobby, but don't you think you're overdoing it? You're always so tired." Or this dog thing, it's sweet, but all that dog hair. Our house used to be pristine. He framed his condescension as care. He minimized my passion, reducing it to a quaint little project, a distraction for a bored wife. He never once asked about the veterans I worked with. He never asked about Buster's progress. To him, Buster was just a temporary, hairy inconvenience. Except, of course, when it was convenient for him. On social media, Scott was the world's biggest dog lover. He'd post a picture of himself with Buster, a carefully staged photo where he took out Buster's ears for the 30 seconds it took to get the shot, with a caption like "hanging with my best bud after a long week. #dogdad #man's best friend." He was building a brand, and Buster was just another prop. The divorce, when it came, was brutal and fast. Scott announced it one evening, with the same casual air he might use to say we were out of milk. He had met someone else, someone, he explained with infuriating calm, who was more aligned with his life's trajectory. It was a clinical corporate speak execution. There was no emotion, no regret, just a severance package. And that's exactly how he treated the division of our assets, like a hostile takeover, where he was the victor. He had the high-powered lawyer, the litany of complaints, the carefully documented list of every single thing he had ever paid for. He wanted the house, the cars, the savings, the investments. He argued that his income had funded our lifestyle, and my hobby at the hospital contributed nothing. We ended up in a sterile mediation room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. My lawyer, an overworked and underpaid woman who seemed perpetually flustered, was no match for Scott's legal shark. Scott's lawyer laid out the offer. It was insulting. I would get a sliver of the savings, my own car, and a pittance of alimony for a short period. I was about to be left with almost nothing after 15 years of marriage. My lawyer stammered, trying to argue for fairness, for my contributions as a homemaker and partner. But Scott's lawyer just smiled, a thin, reptilian smile. Then came the performance. Scott held up a hand, silencing his own lawyer. He turned to me, his face a perfect mask of sorrowful generosity. "Audrey," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion, "I know this is hard, and I know how much you love that dog." He paused, for dramatic effect. The mediator, A weary-looking man named Mr. Peterson leaned forward, interested. "I'm willing to give up a lot," Scott continued, "but I can't take him away from you. So I want you to have him, full custody. No questions asked. Buster stays with you." The room was silent. I was too stunned to speak. He was offering me a dog that wasn't his to give. He was framing it as a monumental sacrifice, a concession of a priceless, shared emotional asset. My lawyer, completely ignorant of the truth, looked relieved. Mr. Peterson, the mediator, positively beamed at Scott. "Well," Mr. Peterson said. He clearly impressed. That is very generous of you, Mr. Scott. Truly." Scott gave a sad, noble little nod. "She deserves that much," he said, looking at me with what he probably thought was a convincing expression of heartbreak. It was a checkmate. In that moment, he had painted himself as the magnanimous, heartbroken husband, and me as the emotional woman who was getting the one thing she truly cared about. The financial discussion that followed was a joke. Mr. Peterson, now firmly in Scott's camp, saw the numbers through that lens of generosity. Every time my lawyer tried to push for more, the mediator would glance at me, then at the empty space by my chair where Buster would have been, and say things like, "Well, considering Mr. Scott's very significant emotional concession, my settlement was slashed. I was awarded a fraction of what I should have received." All because the judge had been blinded by a lie. I walked out of that room with a court order solidifying the insult, my mind a screaming void of shock and fury. Scott had not only cheated me, he had used the purest thing in my life, my work with those dogs, as the weapon to do it. And as I drove away, the cold, hard reality began to set in. He thought he had won. He had no idea what he had just done. The drive from the courthouse to my new life, a small beige-walled apartment that still smelled of the previous tenant's air freshener, was a blur. My hands were shaking so hard on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. The cityscape smeared past the windows, a watercolor painting ruined by tears I refused to let fall. It was a cold, clinical kind of rage, the kind that settles deep in your bones, a chilling counterpoint to the hot flush of humiliation burning on my cheeks. Hizotimol on my cheeks. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. Scott's practiced, sorrowful expression, the mediator's fawning approval, my own lawyer's helpless shrug. He had played them all like a violin, and I was the discordant screech they were all eager to silence. I parked my car, the one asset he'd so graciously allowed me to keep, and trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to my new front door. The apartment felt like a stranger's home. The few boxes of my belongings, clothes, books, personal effects he hadn't bothered to claim, were stacked against one wall, a pathetic monument to a dismantled life. The grand, spacious house, with its manicured lawn, was gone. In its place was this box, this holding cell for the woman I used to be. I sank onto the floor, my back against the cold drywall, and finally, the dam broke. It wasn't just crying. It was a guttural, soul-emptying sob that tore through me. The sound of 15 years of carefully managed composure, disintegrating into nothing. In that moment of total collapse, my mind did what it does when it can't process the present. It fled to the past. Suddenly, I wasn't in the empty apartment anymore. I was back at the beginning, at a dinner party nearly a decade ago. Scott was holding court, telling some witty story about a client, and I was refilling wine glasses, playing the part of the perfect hostess. My friend Clara pulled me aside in the kitchen. She said, "He's so charming, Audrey, but does he ever talk about you like that?" With that much animation, I had laughed it off. "He's a storyteller, Clara. It's what he does," but the question had planted a seed. I started to notice it. He talked about me, but rarely to me in those settings. I was part of the set dressing, the lovely wife, the beautiful home, an accessory to his success. It was the first time I realized that my identity in our marriage was reflective. Like the moon, I only shone when his light was on me. Then my mind jumped forward to the day I first walked into the Veterans Hospital. The air inside smelled of antiseptic and something else, something like quiet courage. I was nervous, feeling like an intruder. I had signed up to volunteer on a whim, feeling a desperate need for something that was just mine, something Scott couldn't brand or co-opt. That's when I met Major Thompson. He was the program director for the therapy animal unit, a man carved from granite and quiet dignity. He had a formidable presence, with a stern face and eyes that had seen far too much. But when he spoke about his recruits, his entire demeanor softened. He walked me through the kennels, introducing me to each dog, not by a number, but by their name and personality. "This is Daisy. She's a bit shy, but she's got a heart the size of Texas," he'd say. "Or watch out for Rocky. He'll try to lick you to death." And then he stopped in front of one particular kennel. Inside, a young golden retriever, with enormous, clumsy paws and soulful brown eyes, tilted his head, his tail giving a tentative thump 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 against the concrete floor. "And this," Major Thompson said, a rare small smile touching his lips, "is Buster. He's a goofball, thinks he's a lapdog, but he's got the gift. He knows when someone's hurting." I felt an instant connection. That weekend, after filling out a mountain of paperwork and signing a detailed foster agreement that explicitly stated the dog was the property of the VA program and was to be returned unharmed every Sunday evening, I brought Buster home for the first time. The moment he walked into our house, he transformed it. He filled the quiet, sterile spaces with a clumsy, joyful energy. Scott's reaction was lukewarm at best. He barely looked up from his laptop when I introduced them. "Oh, right. The charity dog," he'd said. Over the next few months, his indifference hardened into a kind of passive-aggressive annoyance. He'd complain about the dog hair on his suit jackets. He'd sigh dramatically if Buster's water bowl was refilled too loudly while he was on a conference call. He never walked him. He never fed him. He never once got on the floor to play with him. Buster was my responsibility, my project, my problem. But my memory, cruel and sharp, served up a different image. A sunny Saturday afternoon. We were hosting a barbecue for some of Scott's important clients. I saw Scott call Buster over, snap a leash on him, and parade him around the yard, accepting compliments from everyone on his beautiful, well-behaved dog. He's a great companion," I overheard him telling a potential client. "Really keeps you grounded." A few minutes later, once the performance was over, I saw him clip the leash to a tree in the far corner of the yard and walk away, leaving Buster to watch the party from a distance. He wasn't a companion. He was an advertisement. He saw things, not beings. He saw me. He saw Buster. He saw our home. And all he saw were assets to be leveraged. The spiral of memories brought me back to the present, to the cold floor of my empty apartment. The sobs had subsided, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. And in that hollow space, a new feeling began to crystallize. It was cold, clear, and sharp as glass. I looked down. I had come home from the courthouse, so distraught that I hadn't even dropped Buster back at the hospital yet. He had padded over to me at some point during my breakdown, resting his heavy, warm head on my knee, his brown eyes full of a quiet, non-judgmental concern that no human had shown me all day. He was a creature of pure empathy, and Scott had used him. He had taken this animal, a tool of healing meant for a wounded soldier, and debased him, turning him into a bargaining chip in a grubby financial squabble. My eyes fell on Buster's collar. Tucked behind his name tag was a small metal disc. I reached down and turned it over. It was stamped with an official-looking seal and a registration number, followed by the words, "Property of the Westmoreland VA Hospital Therapy Animal Program." That was it. That was the catalyst. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the house, or the car, or the years of being minimized. This was a different kind of violation. Scott hadn't just lied to the court about a marital asset. He had, through his greed and arrogance, interfered with a registered, recognized program for veterans. He had used an instrument of therapy as an instrument of fraud. A strange calm washed over me, displacing the grief and panic. It was the calm of absolute certainty. The fight wasn't over, it had just begun. I got up off the floor, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and took a long, steadying drink. I looked back at Buster, who was watching me, his tail giving a soft thump against the linoleum. This was not about getting even. It was about setting things right. It wasn't about revenge, until, in that exact moment, it was. And it was going to be meticulous. The first phone call I made the next morning was not to my family or my friends. It was to a name I'd gotten from Clara, my one friend, who had seen the cracks in my marriage long before I did. The name belonged to a lawyer named Sarah Collins. Clara had described her as a velvet-draped bulldozer. She specialized in contentious divorces, particularly those involving hidden assets and financial fraud. She was expensive, more than I could really afford, but I drained what was left of my personal savings to pay her retainer. It was the best money I ever spent. Our first meeting was in her office, a space that was the complete opposite of my previous lawyer's cluttered den. It was minimalist, modern, with a huge window overlooking the city. Sarah herself was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She listened intently, without interruption, as I recounted the entire saga of the mediation. I told her about Scott's performative generosity, the mediator's reaction, and the resulting paltry settlement. When I finished, she leaned back in her leather chair, her expression unreadable. "Audrey," she said, her voice even, "I'm going to be blunt. On the surface, what you've described is a raw deal, but not necessarily an illegal one. He offered an emotional asset. The mediator overvalued it, and you got a smaller settlement. It's hard to fight the subjective valuation of a pet in a divorce proceeding. It's a he said, she said on what the dog was worth to you." My heart sank. For a moment I thought I had wasted my money. "But that's the thing, Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. I slid it across the polished mahogany desk. "Buster isn't my pet. He isn't Scott's pet. He's not a marital asset at all." Sarah opened the folder. Inside was a copy of my weekend foster agreement with the Veterans Hospital, Buster's official registration certificate with the stamped serial number, and a printout from the hospital's website describing the therapy animal program. She read through the documents slowly, her eyes scanning each line. The silence in the room stretched on. Then she looked up at me, and for the first time, a small, dangerous smile played on her lips. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, this changes everything. Your husband didn't just misrepresent an asset, Audrey. He committed fraud upon the court. He used a documented, registered therapy animal belonging to a federal program as a pawn to manipulate a legal proceeding for financial gain. This isn't just a raw deal. This is a potential felony." The word felony hung in the air, electric and terrifying. This was bigger than I had even realized. Sarah's energy had completely shifted. The calm professional was gone, replaced by the velvet-draped bulldozer Clara had described. "We're not going to ask to renegotiate," she said, her voice now humming with strategic excitement. "We're going to let him walk into that final hearing thinking he's the king of the world. And then we're going to detonate this. We'll file a motion to vacate the original settlement based on fraudulent misrepresentation. And we're going to need to bring in the big guns." The big guns, it turned out, was Major Thompson. That was my next, and most dreaded, meeting. I felt a profound sense of shame, as if I had somehow let the program down by getting one of its animals tangled in my messy personal life. I called him and asked if I could meet with him privately. He agreed, his voice on the phone its usual gruff but courteous tone. I drove Buster back to the hospital for our meeting. As we walked down the familiar, antiseptic-scented hallway, my stomach was in knots. I felt like a child, confessing to breaking a priceless vase. I sat opposite Major Thompson in his small utilitarian office, which was decorated with framed photos of graduating service dogs with their veteran partners. Buster, sensing my anxiety, lay down and put his head on my feet, a warm, reassuring weight. I told him everything. I didn't spare myself. I told him how Scott had never cared for the dog, how he'd used him as a prop, and the final, humiliating blow in the mediator's office. As I spoke, the major's face remained impassive, a stony mask. I braced myself for a lecture, for his anger, for him to tell me I could no longer be a volunteer. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was low and rumbling, like distant thunder. "This man," he began, "this husband of yours, he took an animal that my team has spent hundreds of hours training, an animal destined to save the life of a soldier tormented by memories you and I can't even imagine. And he used him to cheat you out of a few $1,000s. I just nodded, unable to speak. "This isn't your shame, Audrey," he said, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were blazing. This was not the anger I had expected. It was a righteous, focused fury. It wasn't directed at me at all. "This is a desecration. It's an insult to every man and woman who has ever worn a uniform. It's an insult to the very mission of this hospital." He stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick file labeled Buster. "This dog," he said, tapping the folder, "is slated to be placed in 3 months with a retired Army sergeant named Frank Miller. Frank did 3 tours in Afghanistan. He lost most of his unit in an IED attack. He hasn't slept through the night in 6 years. His wife left him because she couldn't handle the nightmares. Buster is his last hope. That's what your husband used as a bargaining chip." Hearing that, hearing the name of the man Buster was meant for, made it all so real. The stakes were suddenly immense. This wasn't a subplot in my divorce. My divorce was a grotesque interruption of a life-saving mission. Major Thompson closed the file with a sharp snap. "You have my full cooperation," he said. "You tell your lawyer to contact me directly. I will provide a sworn affidavit. I will provide every piece of documentation we have. And if she needs me to, I will show up in that courtroom in my dress uniform, and I will testify to exactly what your husband has interfered with." Men like him, men who see honor and service and sacrifice as things to be twisted for personal gain, they need to be taught a lesson. He had become my most powerful ally. The plan was now set in motion, a silent, intricate machine being assembled in the background. Sarah began drafting the legal documents. She explained the strategy in detail. We would not alert Scott or his lawyer to the specifics. We would let the initial fraudulent settlement stand on paper until the final hearing, which was in 3 weeks. Scott would continue to believe he had won. The day before the hearing, Sarah would file our motion with the court, along with Major Thompson's explosive affidavit and all of Buster's documentation. It would be a bombshell, dropped at the last possible second for maximum impact. In the meantime, I had a role to play. The defeated ex-wife. I had to let Scott believe his manipulation had worked. I continued to pick Buster up on Friday evenings and drop him off on Sunday nights, a routine that now felt freighted with a secret, dangerous purpose. Every time I looked at Buster, I thought of Sergeant Frank Miller, and I felt my resolve harden from glass into steel. My quiet suffering was over. My quiet planning had just begun, and the silence was about to become deafening for Scott. The first move in our silent war was a masterpiece of legal subtlety. 2 weeks before the final hearing, Sarah sent a single, elegantly worded letter to Scott's lawyer. It was deliberately, terrifyingly vague. It didn't mention fraud. It didn't mention the Veterans Hospital. It simply stated, "We are writing to inform you that we have recently come into possession of new dispositive information regarding the non-marital nature of the canine, Buster, referenced in the preliminary settlement agreement. This information carries with it significant legal and financial ramifications for your client's representations to the court. We will be addressing the matter in full at the scheduled hearing." That was it. Just a few lines of carefully chosen jargon. It was a single stone tossed into the placid pond of Scott's victory, designed to create ripples of panic, and it worked better than we could have ever imagined. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Scott. I let it go to voicemail, just as Sarah had instructed. The message he left was dripping with his signature condescending charm. Audrey, darling, I got a very strange letter from my lawyer. Something about your lawyer? Sounds like you're having some second thoughts. Listen, don't let some shark talk you into wasting your money, trying to squeeze more out of me. We had a fair deal. You got what you wanted most. Let's not make this ugly. Call me. I played the message for Sarah over the phone. I could almost hear her smiling. He's testing the waters, she said. He thinks it's about money. He's trying to manage you. Your only response, if he contacts you again, is one sentence. You have to speak with my lawyer, Sarah Collins. Nothing else. Don't explain. Don't argue. Don't engage. She testing the waters, she said in main ned Bain. For the next week, I lived by that mantra. Scott tried again, a text message this time. Seriously, Audrey, what is this? In not playing games? I replied exactly as instructed. You'll have to speak with my lawyer, Sarah Collins. His response came back instantly. Unbelievable. After everything I did for you, the mask was beginning to slip. His panic started to curdle into anger. He called again, and again I let it go to voicemail. The message this time was different. The charm was gone, replaced by a hard, impatient edge. Audrey, pick up the phone. My lawyer is getting spooked by this. He keeps asking me what non-marital natures means. What did you tell them? Did you lie about something? You better not be creating problems for me. This is settled. You got the dog. It's over. He still didn't get it. His arrogance was so profound that he couldn't even conceive of the real issue. In his mind, the dog was an object, a prize. The only conflict he could imagine was over its ownership or its monetary value. The idea that the dog didn't belong to either of us was a concept so foreign to his worldview that it didn't even enter his calculations. He was trapped in a room of his own making, and he couldn't find the door because he didn't realize the walls were made of his own lies. The real fun began when his lawyer called Sarah. It was a tense, probing conversation which Sarah recounted to me with glee. Scott's lawyer, a man named Henderson, tried to play it cool. Sarah, Bill Henderson here, just following up on your letter. A bit of a surprise, I must admit. We thought this was all wrapped up. What's this about the non-marital status of the animal? Is your client now claiming she owned it prior to the marriage? Sarah's response was a work of art. Bill, she said, her voice calm and professional, I can assure you the information we have is thoroughly documented and verified. And no, my client is not claiming prior ownership. The asset in question does not, and has never belonged to either party. As for the details, we'll be presenting them in full to the judge. I'm sure you and your client will find it very illuminating. She told me. Henderson was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You're accusing my client of hiding an asset. Oh no, Bill, Sarah replied sweetly. Quite the opposite. We're accusing him of inventing one. That phone call was the turning point. Henderson, the legal shark, could smell blood in the water, and he knew it might be his client's. The pressure on Scott must have intensified exponentially. His text to me became frantic, a barrage of accusations and demands. What the hell did you do? Henderson is freaking out. He thinks I'm hiding something. This is about the settlement, isn't it? You're trying to extort me. It won't work. I have the signed agreement. Audrey, I swear, if you ruin my reputation over this, you will regret it. I'm not fooling around. I saved every single message, forwarding them to Sarah, who was compiling them into a neat little file she cheerfully labeled Antagonist Meltdown. We were building a secondary case, a portrait of his character, manipulative when he thought he was in control, and threatening when he felt that control slipping. The final week before the hearing was a slow-motion demolition of Scott's composure. He tried to show up at my apartment. I saw him from my window, pacing on the sidewalk below, looking up at my apartment with a thunderous expression on his face. He buzzed the intercom. I didn't answer. He stayed there for 20 minutes, a storm cloud of impotent rage, before finally getting in his car and speeding away. The voicemails became unhinged. They were no longer the words of a charming, successful man. They were the desperate ramblings of a cornered animal. You think you're so clever, don't you? You and your bulldozer lawyer. What could you possibly have? What could be so dispositive? It's a dog, for God's sake. A stupid, hairy dog. You wanted him. I gave him to you. That's generosity. That's kindness. And you're spitting in my face. He still didn't see it. He was so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't perceive the truth, even as the consequences of his lie were closing in around him. He was a man drowning in an ocean he couldn't see, cursing the rain. The day before the hearing, Sarah filed the motion. It landed on the judge's desk with a metaphorical thud. A thick packet containing my statement, Major Thompson's sworn and notarized affidavit on official VA letterhead, Buster's complete file, including his registration and placement plan for Sergeant Frank Miller, and as a cherry on top, the transcriptions of every single one of Scott's increasingly abusive voicemails and text messages. The trap was set. The silent takeover was complete. Aim the T. All we had to do now was wait for the show. Scott was about to walk into his final hearing, expecting to sign a few papers and walk away a victor. Instead, he was walking into his own public execution. The power shift became palpable in the days leading up to the hearing. It wasn't just Scott's panic. It was the way his carefully constructed world began to fray at the edges. His support system, which had been a formidable wall of polite smiles and quiet judgment against me, started to crumble. It began with his parents. They had been his staunchest defenders throughout the divorce, calling me every few days to deliver sanctimonious little lectures wrapped in concern. "Audrey dear, we know you're hurting," his mother would say, her voice syrupy sweet, "but you must understand, Scott needs to be happy. Tearing him down in court won't bring you peace." They had fully bought into the narrative of Scott the magnanimous victim and Audrey the bitter, emotional ex. But Scott, in his spiraling panic, made a fatal error. He called them, not for support, but in a rage, demanding to know if I had spoken to them, if I had somehow conspired with them. I found this out later from my former sister-in-law, who called me in a state of shock. Apparently, Scott had screamed at his own mother, accusing her of not controlling the situation and demanding she fix it. His polished facade had cracked not just for me, but for them. They heard the raw, ugly entitlement that I had lived with for years. For the first time, they were on the receiving end of his venom, and they didn't like it. Their calls to me stopped. A wall of silence went up. It was the first brick to fall from his fortress. The next to go was Mark, Scott's best friend and golfing buddy. Mark was the one who was always clapping Scott on the back, the one who loved the photos of Scott with Buster. Mark saw Scott as the epitome of success. He called me one afternoon, his voice hesitant. "Hey Audrey, listen, Scott's been acting weird. He's been calling me at all hours, rambling about you and some legal trick. Said you're trying to ruin him over the dog. What's going on?" Following Sarah's script, I was calm and maddeningly opaque. "Hi Mark, I can't really talk about the details. It's a legal matter now. You should probably ask Scott." I paused, then added, "But I will say this, everything is going to come out in court on Thursday. It should be very clarifying." The word clarifying did its job. Mark was a man who valued his reputation above all else. The last thing he wanted was to be splattered by the shrapnel of Scott's implosion. "Right," he said quickly. "Okay, got it. Well, take care Audrey." He hung up. I knew with absolute certainty that Mark would be screening Scott's calls from that moment on. Another brick had fallen. Scott was becoming an island. The most satisfying desertion, however, was his new girlfriend, the one he had left me for, the woman who was more aligned with his life's trajectory. Her name was Tiffany, and she was a decade younger than me, an ambitious marketing manager who seemed to view Scott as a career move. Scott, in his desperation, must have confessed some version of the situation to her, likely painting himself as the victim of my crazy, vindictive plot. But Tiffany was no fool. She was a calculator. She had attached herself to Scott's brand of success, stability and charm. The man he was becoming, panicked, erratic, potentially facing legal trouble, was a bad investment. I found out through the grapevine that she had quietly packed a bag and gone to stay with her sister for a few days to give him some space. She was hedging her bets, positioning herself for a clean exit. The rats were not just leaving the ship, they were commandeering the lifeboats. The night before the hearing, the final, desperate act of counter-manipulation arrived. It came in the form of a 3-page email, sent at 2 a.m. It was a chaotic, rambling tirade that swung wildly between feigned remorse, blatant gaslighting, and outright threats. It started with a pathetic attempt at a love bomb. "Audrey, I can't sleep. I'm thinking about us, about everything we had. I know I made mistakes. I was under a lot of pressure at work, and I didn't appreciate you the way I should have. I see that now." Then it pivoted to classic victim blaming. "But I don't understand why you're doing this, why you're trying to destroy me. I gave you the one thing you loved more than anything. I gave you Buster. I did that out of love, Audrey. Real, selfless love. And you've taken that beautiful gesture, and you've twisted it into something ugly and cruel, with this lawyer of yours." Then came the gaslighting. "You're being manipulated. This Sarah woman is just trying to run up her bill. Can't you see that? She's poisoning you against me. The deal we made was fair. It was more than fair. You're emotional right now, and you're not thinking clearly. You're going to look back on this and feel so much regret." And finally, the threat, veiled in a thin veneer of concern. "If you go through with this, if you try to embarrass me in court, you will be making a terrible mistake. It will have consequences you can't even imagine. Think about your reputation. Think about what people will say. Just drop this, Audrey. For both our sakes, let's go back to the deal. It's the right thing to do." I read the email, and I didn't feel anger or fear. I felt a profound sense of pity for him. He was completely lost, trapped in a prison of his own ego. He was still trying to use the same old tools of manipulation that had worked for 15 years, not realizing that I had changed the locks. I forwarded the email to Sarah with a single line. "Thought you might want to add this to the file." Her reply came back a minute later. "Merry Christmas." The power shift was complete. Scott was alone, his support system gone, his manipulative tactics useless. He was walking into that courtroom, armed with a lie, while I was walking in armed with the truth, and the truth, I was beginning to realize, was a much, much heavier weapon. The morning of the final hearing was gray and overcast. The sky, the color of slate, it suited the mood perfectly. I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A simple, dark blue dress, professional and understated. I wasn't there to make a statement with my clothes. My statement was in a thick manila folder tucked into Sarah's briefcase. When we walked into the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick, with a tense, low-level hum. Scott was already there, sitting next to his lawyer, Henderson. He looked terrible. His usually impeccable suit was slightly rumpled. His hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He shot me a look of pure venom, a desperate, last-ditch attempt at intimidation. I met his gaze, held it for a moment, and gave him nothing back. No fear, no anger, no sadness, just a calm, blank slate. It visibly unnerved him. He looked away first. In the public gallery behind me, 2 figures sat in the front row. One was Clara, my rock, who gave my shoulder a supportive squeeze as I passed. The other was Major Thompson. As he had promised, he was in his full dress uniform. The crisp blue fabric, the polished buttons, the rows of ribbons on his chest. He was a silent, powerful testament to the gravity of what was about to happen. His presence alone changed the very air in the room. The judge, a man named Judge Albright, who had a reputation for being impatient and sharp-tongued, swept into the room and took his seat. He put on his glasses and shuffled through the papers in front of him. "All right," he said, his voice gravelly. "Case number 734, Scott versus Scott. My clerk tells me We have a signed settlement agreement. We just need to finalize it, and we can all get on with our lives. Mr. Henderson, are we ready? Henderson stood up, looking pale. Yes, Your Honor. Scott puffed out his chest, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. This was it, the finish line. Miss Collins, the judge asked, looking over his spectacles at Sarah. Any reason we can't stamp this and go home? Sarah stood up, her movements fluid and confident. Yes, Your Honor. A very significant reason. She placed her hands on the lectern. We have filed a motion to vacate the preliminary settlement agreement on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation and bad faith negotiation by the petitioner, Mr. Scott. The judge's eyebrows shot up. A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. Scott's face, which had been smug just a second before, went slack with shock. Henderson looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Fraud, Judge Albright repeated, his voice laced with annoyance. Miss Collins, that's a very serious accusation. You'd better have more than sour grapes. I do, Your Honor, Sarah said calmly. She gestured to the thick file on the judge's desk. In that motion, you will find irrefutable proof that the primary emotional asset that Mr. Scott so generously conceded to my client, the dog, Buster, is not, and has never been, marital property. In fact, it is not property that can be disposed of by either party in any capacity. The judge frowned and opened the file. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear the rustle of paper as he turned the first page. He read my affidavit first, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the next document. I saw his eyes widen slightly. It was Major Thompson's affidavit on official VA letterhead. The judge's gaze flickered up from the paper and scanned the gallery, landing on the major in his dress uniform. The judge, I knew from Sarah's research, was himself a veteran. A connection was made. A silent understanding passed between the two men. Judge Albright continued to read, his face growing darker with every page. He saw Buster's registration certificate. He saw the foster agreement. He saw the detailed placement plan for Sergeant Frank Miller, complete with a summary of the sergeant's service record and medical needs. He saw the mission of the therapy animal program. And then, he saw the transcripts of Scott's voicemails and the final rambling 2 a.m. email. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Scott was visibly sweating now, his face the color of ash. He kept whispering frantically to Henderson, who was just shaking his head, his eyes glued to the judge. Finally, Judge Albright put the papers down. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, his eyes were like chips of ice. He wasn't looking at Sarah or me. His gaze was fixed, with laser-like intensity, on Scott. Mr. Scott, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. Let me see if I understand this. You came into a mediation, overseen by an officer of this court, and you pretended to make a grand, magnanimous sacrifice. Scott started to speak, but the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. You offered to give your wife a dog that you portrayed as a beloved family pet, a significant emotional asset. You did this, knowing it would influence the mediator's perception of your character and directly impact the financial settlement awarded to your wife. Your Honor, Scott stammered. Be silent, the judge snapped. His voice was no longer quiet. It was a roar that echoed through the room. Because it gets worse. This wasn't just any dog. This was a registered therapy animal. An animal owned by, and in service to, a program for disabled military veterans. Is that correct, Mr. Scott? Scott was frozen, a statue of terror. He just stared, speechless. You took an animal, the judge continued, his voice dripping with contempt, an animal specifically trained to provide comfort and healing to a soldier who has borne the battle for this country, and you used it as a common bargaining chip. You used that soldier's hope for a normal life as a lever to cheat your wife in a divorce. Is that the long and short of it, sir? The new reality hit the room like a physical blow. The story was no longer about a bitter divorce. It was about a man who had desecrated something sacred for profit. The judge looked at the preliminary settlement agreement on his desk. With a flick of his wrist, swept it into the trash can beside him. "The settlement is vacated," he declared. "Effective immediately. And furthermore, given the evidence of fraudulent disclosure and what appears to be a deliberate attempt to deceive this court, I am ordering a full, independent, forensic accounting of every single one of your financial assets, Mr. Scott. Everything. And I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for potential investigation into perjury and fraud." Scott made a small, strangled sound. His entire world had just been vaporized. The judge wasn't finished. He looked at me, his expression softening for the first time. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to apologize, on behalf of the court, for our failure to see this deception earlier. And I want to commend you for your service to our veterans. It is good and honorable work." He banged his gavel. "We are done here." It was over. Scott sat there, utterly broken, as his lawyer tried to speak to him. He didn't respond. He just stared into the middle distance. A man who had just watched his life burn to the ground. He had tried to take everything. But in the end, the one thing he so generously gave me was the one thing that cost him it all. The months that followed the hearing were like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into the sun. The world seemed brighter, the air cleaner. The forensic accounting of Scott's finances uncovered exactly what Sarah and I suspected: hidden accounts, undervalued assets, a web of financial deceit that went far beyond what he had disclosed. The new settlement I received was more than fair. It gave me the capital to truly start over, not just to survive. Scott, on the other hand, was mired in a legal swamp. The district attorney's office did in fact open an investigation. His reputation was shattered. Clients left his firm in droves. His so-called friends, like Mark, treated him like a pariah. Tiffany, the aligned girlfriend, was long gone. He had to sell the beautiful house to pay his mounting legal fees. His downfall was as swift and total as it was deserved. I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction, not a gleeful joy, but the simple, clean feeling of a great wrong being righted. He wasn't defeated by me. He was defeated by the weight of his own character. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months later, I was at a park near the Veterans Hospital. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. I wasn't there to volunteer. I was there to watch a reunion. Across the grassy field, Buster was playing fetch, his tail a blurry propeller of happiness. He wasn't my weekend foster anymore. He was home. His companion was a man in a wheelchair, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sergeant Frank Miller. Watching them together was a bittersweet ache. I missed Buster's clumsy affection, his warm presence in my now quiet apartment. But seeing the look on Sergeant Miller's face, as Buster dropped the ball at his feet and nudged his hand, that was a deeper, more resonant joy. This was Buster's purpose. This was what it was all for. Major Thompson came and stood beside me, on the path. We watched them for a moment in comfortable silence. "You know," he said, "the local news picked up the story of what happened in court. Didn't use names, but the details were there. Local man's divorce scheme, involving VA therapy dog, backfires spectacularly." He chuckled. "Donations to the program have tripled. We've been able to expand, to bring in 5 new recruits. More Busters for more Franks." My small personal victory had created a ripple of good in the world. Scott's selfish act, once exposed, had inadvertently become a catalyst for the very thing he disdained. It was the ultimate irony. As I reflect on it all now, I realize the most important lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about value. Scott saw value only in things that could be bought, sold, or leveraged. Money, status, property. He looked at a creature like Buster and saw a prop. He looked at my volunteer work and saw a waste of time. He couldn't understand that the most valuable things in life, kindness, integrity, service, empathy, have no price tag. His blindness to that simple truth was his fatal flaw. He tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of lies, and one good dog, without even trying, brought the whole thing crashing down. He thought he was giving me a dog, but what he really gave me was my freedom. So I want to ask you all, have you ever had someone in your life completely misjudge what is important to you? Have you ever had to fight to defend something that other people saw as worthless? Let me know your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences remind all of us that we're not alone in these struggles. Thank you for being here with me today. If my story resonated with you, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Until then, take care of yourselves and remember to value the things that truly matter.